Imagine a house that looks warm and cozy, but inside, it's a ticking time bomb of secrets ready to explode. Meet David, a dad holding it together by a thread, and Ethan, his 19-year-old son, whose every glance feels like a spark in a room full of dynamite. 2 years ago, their world was ripped apart, and now every creak of the floorboard screams tension. Something's brewing, something raw, dangerous, and way too close to the edge. A late night conversation, a single moment that changes everything, and suddenly, the line between love and chaos blurs. What's pulling them together? What's tearing them apart? You won't believe where this is headed. This isn't just a story, it's a heart-pounding dive into the messy, human stuff we don't talk about. The house felt emptier than it should have, even with its warm lights and familiar creaks. David stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot of chili, Ethan's favorite, or at least it used to be before everything changed. The scent of tomatoes and spices filled the air, but it couldn't mask the hollow ache in David's chest. It had been 2 years since Sarah's passing, a loss that carved a void between him and his son, Ethan, now 19 and a freshman in college. David glanced at the fridge, where a faded photo of the three of them, Sarah laughing, Ethan grinning with braces, David's arm around them both, hung like a relic of a life that no longer existed. Grief had a way of reshaping everything. For David, it was sleepless nights and endless tasks to keep the house alive, as if tidying up could stitch their broken world back together. For Ethan, it was silence. He'd retreated into himself after the funeral, spending hours in his room or out with friends, avoiding any mention of his mother. David didn't push. He knew Ethan needed space. Instead, he poured his love into small gestures. Notes slipped under Ethan's door with words like, "You've got this, kid," or extra bacon on his breakfast plate. But months passed, and the distance between them grew, a quiet chasm David didn't know how to bridge. Tonight, though, something felt different. David was scrubbing a pan when he heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, on the hardwood floor. He turned to see Ethan standing in the kitchen doorway, his lanky frame leaning against the frame, his dark hair falling into his eyes. At 19, he was no longer the boy who'd clung to David after nightmares, but there was a vulnerability in his posture that tugged at David's heart. "Me help, Dad." Ethan's voice was quiet, almost shy, a tone David hadn't heard in months. David blinked, caught off guard. "Sure, bud," he said, forcing a smile. "Grab a towel, dry these dishes." Ethan nodded and stepped forward, taking the towel from David's outstretched hand. Their fingers brushed briefly, and David felt a flicker of warmth. Maybe that this was a step towards something better. They worked in silence, the clink of plates and the hum of the dishwasher filling the space. David stole glances at Ethan, noticing the way his jaw tightened, as if he was holding something back. "How's school?" David asked, trying to keep his tone light. "It's fine," Ethan replied, eyes fixed on the plate he was drying. His voice was flat, but the fact that he'd answered at all felt like a victory. David hesitated, then added, "If you ever want to talk, I'm here. About anything." Ethan nodded, his movements slowing. "I know," he said softly, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was something in Ethan's gaze, intense, searching, that made David's stomach twist, though he couldn't name why. He turned back to the sink, focusing on the suds, telling himself he was imagining things. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's presence became more constant. He'd linger in the living room while David watched old sitcoms, sprawling on the couch with a textbook he'd barely read. He started helping with small chores, taking out the trash, raking leaves in the backyard, tasks he'd avoided since Sarah's death. David felt a cautious relief, like they were rediscovering each other. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table over Ethan's attempt at spaghetti, he looked up and said, "You're kind of amazing, Dad." David laughed, brushing it off. "Just doing my job, kid." But Ethan's expression didn't shift. His eyes, a deep brown like Sarah's, held a weight that made David's chest tighten. "Thanks for everything," Ethan added, his voice low, almost reverent. "It means a lot to hear that," David said, his throat dry. He wanted to say more, to ask what was behind that look, but the moment felt fragile, like it might shatter if he pressed too hard. As days passed, Ethan's small gestures grew more frequent. He'd hover in the kitchen while David cooked, leaning against the counter, closer than necessary. "You look good today, Dad," he said one morning, his voice casual but his eyes lingering. David's heart skipped, a mix of flattery and unease. "Thanks, Ethan," he replied, turning away to hide his flush. He told himself it was just Ethan trying to reconnect to fill the void Sarah left. But there was something in the air, a subtle shift, a warmth that felt both comforting and dangerous. David lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the fans hum a faint echo of his racing thoughts. He replayed Ethan's words, his glances, the way his shoulder brushed David's during a movie. Was it just grief pulling them closer, or was there something more? The question gnawed at him, stirring a mix of guilt and curiosity he wasn't ready to face. Ethan was his son, 19, and searching for his place in the world, and David's job was to guide him, not complicate things. But the ache in his chest, the longing for connection, felt like a betrayal of that role. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, but the unease lingered, a quiet promise that their story was far from settled. The days after Ethan's unexpected compliment at dinner felt like walking on a tightrope. David wanted to believe they were finding their way back to each other, rebuilding the bond fractured by Sarah's death. But there was a current beneath their interactions, a subtle shift that left him uneasy. Ethan, at 19, was no longer the quiet teenager who hid in his room. He was a young man, a college student navigating his own path. Yet his presence in their suburban home carried a weight David couldn't ignore. The warmth of their renewed connection was undeniable, but so was the flicker of something else, something that made David question himself. Ethan started showing up more, not just in passing, but deliberately. He'd wander into the kitchen while David chopped vegetables, leaning against the counter, his arm brushing David's as he reached for a glass. "Need a hand, Dad?" he'd ask, his voice soft but steady, and David would nod, grateful for the company yet wary of the closeness. They'd work side by side, Ethan slicing carrots, David stirring a pot, the silence between them comfortable but charged, like the air before a storm. David caught himself watching Ethan's hands, steady and deliberate, and wondered when his son had grown into someone so self-assured. One evening, they settled on the couch for a movie night, a ritual they hadn't shared since Ethan was younger. Ethan picked a comedy, one they'd watched a dozen times with Sarah, its familiar lines a bittersweet echo of better days. David sank into the cushions, expecting Ethan to take his usual spot at the far end of the couch. Instead, Ethan sat close, their shoulders almost touching. David shifted slightly, creating a sliver of space, but Ethan didn't move away. Halfway through the movie, Ethan turned to him, his face lit by the TV's glow. "You're always so busy, Dad," he said, his voice low, almost intimate. "You never take time for yourself." David forced a chuckle, caught off guard. "That's what dads do, Ethan. Always something to take care of." But Ethan's gaze didn't waver, his brown eyes holding a depth that made David's chest tighten. "You do too much," Ethan said, his tone earnest. "You deserve a break. Someone to look after you for a change." The words hung in the air, heavy with something unspoken. David's throat felt dry. "That's sweet of you," he managed, turning back to the screen, but his heart was racing. He told himself Ethan was just being kind, trying to bridge the gap left by Sarah's absence. But the way Ethan's voice lingered, the way his eyes traced David's face, felt like more than gratitude. It felt personal, and it scared him. That night, David lay awake, the ceiling fans hum a faint backdrop to his spiraling thoughts. He replayed Ethan's words, the way he leaned closer, the warmth of his shoulder against David's. Was he imagining it? Grief had a way of twisting things, making closeness feel like something it wasn't. But David couldn't deny the pull he felt, a longing for connection, for someone to fill the void Sarah left. He loved Ethan fiercely, as any father would, but the intensity of their moments together stirred something he wasn't ready to name. Guilt washed over him, sharp and cold. Ethan was his son, 19, and searching for his place in the world. David's job was to guide him, not complicate his heart. The next morning, Ethan was already in the kitchen when David came downstairs, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Made you some," he said, sliding one across the counter with a small smile. David took it, his fingers brushing Ethan's, and for a moment, their eyes locked. "You look good today, Dad," Ethan said, his voice casual but his gaze lingering, tracing David's face like he was memorizing it. "Thanks, kid," David replied, turning away to hide the flush creeping up his neck. He busied himself with breakfast, but Ethan stayed close, perched on a stool, watching. "You don't have to do all this, you know?" Ethan said suddenly. The cooking, the notes, all of it. I see how hard you try. David paused, spatula in hand. I do it because I love you, he said, his voice softer than he meant. Ethan's smile faltered, replaced by something deeper, almost vulnerable. I know, he said, his eyes not leaving David's. I want you to know I appreciate it. You're everything to me. The words hit David like a wave, warm but overwhelming. He nodded, unsure how to respond, and turned back to the stove, his hands trembling slightly. Ethan's presence felt like a magnet, pulling him closer, yet pushing him toward a line he didn't want to cross. He tried to focus on the routine, cooking, cleaning, being the steady father Ethan needed, but the air between them crackled with something new. Over the next few days, Ethan's attentiveness grew. He'd linger in the garden while David trimmed hedges, sitting on the bench with a book he'd barely read, stealing glances. This place feels alive because of you, he said one afternoon, his voice quiet but sure. David froze, a pair of shears in hand, the compliment landing like a stone in still water. Just trying to keep things together, he said, forcing a smile. But Ethan's eyes held his, unwavering, and David felt exposed, like Ethan could see the parts of him he kept hidden. By the end of the week, David's unease was a constant hum. He loved Ethan's company, the way it filled the house with life, but every glance, every brush of their shoulders felt like a step into uncharted territory. He caught himself mirroring Ethan's behavior, watching him a little too long, feeling a spark when their hands touched. Was it just grief pulling them in each other's orbit? Or was there something more, something David wasn't ready to face? He sat on the porch one evening, the sunset casting long shadows, and wondered how to keep their bond from slipping into something neither of them could undo. Ethan was his son, his anchor, but the lines between love and longing were blurring, and David didn't know how to stop it. The house had become a maze of unspoken words, each room heavy with the weight of what David and Ethan left unsaid. David moved through his days on autopilot, cooking meals, tending the garden, folding laundry, trying to anchor himself in routine. But Ethan's presence was inescapable. At 19, a college student with a quiet intensity, Ethan seemed to orbit closer with each passing day. His lingering glances, his soft-spoken compliments, had woven a thread of tension that David couldn't untangle. He wanted to believe it was just their shared grief pulling them together, a natural response to the void Sarah's death had left. But deep down, he knew it was more complicated, and the realization gnawed at him, a mix of guilt, fear, and something he wasn't ready to name. Ethan's attentiveness had grown bolder. He'd sit close on the couch, his knee brushing David's during late-night TV sessions, or linger in the kitchen, offering to help with dishes while standing just a step too near. David felt the shift in every interaction. The way Ethan's voice softened when he said, "You're doing so much, Dad," or the way his eyes traced David's movements, like he was searching for something more than a father's approval. David tried to dismiss it, to focus on being the steady parent Ethan needed, but his own heart betrayed him. He caught himself noticing Ethan's quiet confidence, the way his smile mirrored Sarah's, and it stirred a warmth that felt both familiar and forbidden. He hated himself for it, but the loneliness that had haunted him since Sarah's death made Ethan's closeness a dangerous comfort. One evening, David retreated to his bedroom early, hoping the soft glow of his lamp and the pages of a novel would quiet his racing thoughts. The house was still, the only sound the faint hum of the ceiling fan. He'd barely turned a page when a soft knock broke the silence. "Dad!" Ethan's voice was low, hesitant, carrying a weight that made David's chest tighten. He set the book down, his pulse quickening. "Yeah, Ethan," he called, trying to keep his tone steady. "Everything okay? Can I come in?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David glanced at the clock. Past 10, later than Ethan usually stayed up. He hesitated. A part of him wanted to say it was too late, to keep the distance he'd been trying to maintain. But the vulnerability in Ethan's tone pulled at him. "Sure, come in," he said, sitting up on the bed. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the hallway's dim light. He looked different tonight, less like the confident young man David saw at breakfast, more like the boy who'd once crawled into his bed after nightmares. At 19, Ethan was undeniably an adult, his broad shoulders and steady gaze a testament to the years that had passed, but his fidgeting hands betrayed a nervousness that made David's heart ache. "What's on your mind?" David asked, patting the edge of the bed, his voice gentle but cautious. Ethan hesitated, then sat down, leaving a small space between them. For a moment, he stared at the floor, his fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. "I've been thinking a lot," he said finally, his voice low and unsteady. "About us. About everything." David's stomach twisted. He'd sensed this moment coming, had felt it in the air for weeks, but hearing Ethan say it made it real. "What do you mean us?" he asked, his tone careful, though his heart was pounding. Ethan looked up, his brown eyes glistening in the lamplight. "I know it's weird, Dad," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. You've been everything to me since Mom died. You're kind, you're strong, you've kept this house together when I couldn't. And I think about you all the time. Not just as my dad, but more." The words hit David like a tidal wave, crashing through the fragile walls he'd built. He stared at Ethan, his mind racing, searching for the right response. Part of him wanted to shut it down, to stand up and end the conversation before it went further. But another part, the part that had felt so alone, so hollow since Sarah's death, felt a spark of something he couldn't ignore. Ethan's confession, raw and unguarded, mirrored the ache David had buried for years. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog. "Ethan," he said, his voice shaking, "you're my son. I love you, but this isn't right. It can't be." Ethan's shoulders slumped, but his gaze didn't waver. "I know," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I try to stop feeling this way. I try to focus on school, on friends, on figuring out who I am. But every time I'm around you, it's like you're the only one who really sees me, who's always been there. And I don't know how to turn opportunities off." David's throat tightened, his own eyes stinging. He saw the struggle in Ethan's face, the confusion of a young man grappling with emotions too big to contain. At 19, Ethan was searching for his place in the world, maybe even his identity, and David wondered if this was part of that journey. A young gay man mistaking familial love for something deeper. But the thought didn't ease the weight in David's chest. He felt his own heart pulling in two directions: the fierce, protective love of a father and a fleeting, forbidden warmth that scared him to his core. "Ethan," David said, his voice firmer now, "what you're feeling, it's because we've been through so much. Losing your mom, it's messed with us both. But I'm your dad. My job is to guide you, to keep you safe, not to complicate things. We need to set boundaries for both of us." Ethan nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I needed to be honest." David reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder, the gesture meant to comfort, but heavy with the tension between them. "It's okay to feel confused," he said gently. "You're young. You're figuring things out. But this isn't the way. We'll work through it together as father and son." Ethan wiped his eyes, his expression a mix of relief and disappointment. "I don't want to lose you," he said softly. "You won't," David assured him, though his own voice wavered. "We're family. That's what matters." Ethan stood, his movements slow, as if carrying the weight of his confession. "Good night, Dad," he said, his voice barely audible, before turning toward the door. "Good night, Ethan," David replied, watching as the door clicked shut behind him. He sat there, frozen, his hand still tingling where it had touched Ethan's shoulder. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the echo of Ethan's words. David's mind spun, replaying conversation, the look in Ethan's eyes, the way his own heart had faltered. He loved Ethan with every fiber of his being, but the line between love and something else had blurred, and he hated himself for even noticing it. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, the fans hum a faint pulse against his racing thoughts. Ethan's confession had cracked something open, exposing a vulnerability David hadn't faced. He thought of Sarah, of the life they'd built, and how her absence had left him grasping for connection. Was that why Ethan's words stirred him? Or was it something deeper, something he couldn't admit? The guilt was suffocating, but so was the ache for closeness, for someone to fill the empty spaces. David closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, but the weight of that moment lingered, a crossroads he wasn't sure how to navigate. The house was a silent witness to the storm brewing within its walls. David had tried to rebuild the boundaries shattered by Ethan's confession, but the air between them remained heavy, charged with words unspoken and feelings unaddressed. Ethan, at 19, a college student navigating his own identity, seemed to carry a quiet resolve, his presence both a comfort and a challenge. David moved through his days with a forced normalcy, cooking breakfast, tending the garden, smiling through the ache of his chest. But every glance from Ethan, every brush of their shoulders, felt like a spark threatening to ignite something neither could control. He loved his son fiercely, but the loneliness that had haunted him since Sarah's death made Ethan's closeness a dangerous temptation, one he fought to resist. It was a late Friday night, the kind where the world felt suspended in stillness. David lay in bed, the soft hum of the ceiling fan blending with the distant chirp of crickets through the open window. He'd been scrolling through his phone, trying to lose himself in mundane articles, but his mind kept drifting to Ethan's tearful confession days earlier. The memory of his son's trembling voice, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, stir a mix of guilt, fear, and something David couldn't name, a longing that felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for as a father. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to pull him under, when a faint knock at the door jolted him upright. "Dad!" Ethan's voice was soft, almost swallowed by the night's quiet. "Can I come in?" David's heart sank, his pulse quickening. He glanced at the clock. Past midnight. "Ethan, it's late," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "What's wrong? I need to talk." Ethan replied, his tone carrying a weight that made David's chest tighten. He hesitated, every instinct screaming to keep the door closed, to hold the line. But the memory of Ethan's tear-streaked face, the plea in his eyes, softened his resolve. "Okay," he said finally, sitting up. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped into the dim glow of the bedside lamp. He looked different tonight, his broad shoulders hunched, his hands shoved into his pockets, his brown eyes flickering with a mix of determination and fear. At 19, he was undeniably an adult, his features sharpened by the years, but the vulnerability in his posture reminded David of the boy he'd once rocked to sleep. Ethan lingered near the doorway, as if unsure whether to step closer. "What is it, Ethan?" David asked, his voice steady but laced with apprehension. Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze locking onto David's. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I know what you said about boundaries, about being my dad. I try to push it down, to focus on school, on figuring out who I am. But it's like you're the only one who gets me, the only one who's ever been there, no matter what." David's breath caught, his mind reeling. He wanted to interrupt, to stop the words before they went further, but Ethan's intensity held him captive. "Ethan," he started, his voice shaking, "we talked about this. I love you, but I'm your father. That's where it ends." Ethan stepped closer, sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes glistening. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but you've been my whole world since Mom died. You've kept me together, and I feel something more. I can't help it." The air between them crackled, heavy with the weight of his words. David's heart pounded, torn between the urge to pull Ethan into a comforting hug and the need to push him away. He saw the struggle in Ethan's face, the confusion of a young man grappling with emotions too complex to name. David wondered if this was part of Ethan's journey, perhaps an exploration of his identity as a gay young adult, misdirected toward the one person who'd been his anchor. But that thought didn't ease the turmoil in David's chest. His own loneliness, the ache for connection, mirrored Ethan's words in a way that terrified him. "Ethan," David said, his voice low and strained, "you're my son. My job is to guide you, to keep you safe. What you're feeling, it's not real. It's the grief, the loss. We've both been lost without your mom." Ethan's eyes welled with tears, but he leaned closer, his voice desperate. "It feels real to me," he said. "You're the only one who's ever cared about me like this. I don't know how to stop." For a moment, time seemed to pause. David's resolve wavered, his heart caught in a storm of love, guilt, and longing. He saw Ethan's pain, his need for connection, and it echoed his own. The room felt smaller, the space between them shrinking until it was almost nothing. Against every instinct, David felt himself lean forward, drawn by a force he couldn't name. Their eyes locked, and in that fleeting moment, the boundaries they'd fought to maintain dissolved. They came together in a quiet, desperate embrace, a shared vulnerability that crossed a line neither could uncross. It was a moment of weakness, a release of the tension that had built for weeks, wrapped in the warmth of their shared grief. When they pulled apart, The silence was deafening. David's hands trembled, his mind a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. Ethan's face was flushed, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Are you okay?" Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. David nodded, though he wasn't sure. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse. "But this can't happen again." Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the moment had settled over him. "I'm sorry," he said softly, wiping his eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "You didn't," David said, though his heart ached. "We're both just lost right now, but we need to find our way back as father and son." Ethan stood, his movements slow, and paused in the doorway. "Good night, Dad," he said, his voice barely audible. "Good night, Ethan," David replied, watching as the door closed behind him. He locked it, his hands shaking, and sank onto the bed. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, a tangle of guilt, love, and regret. He replayed the moment in his mind, the warmth, the connection, the line they'd crossed, and hated himself for letting it happen. But beneath the guilt was a flicker of truth. He felt alive in that moment, for the first time since Sarah's death. It terrified him. The next morning, Ethan was quiet at breakfast, his eyes fixed on his plate. David tried to act normal, pouring coffee, making small talk about the weather, but the air between them was fragile. Ethan left for class without his usual lingering, and David felt a mix of relief and sadness. He spent the day lost in thought, questioning every choice that had led to this point. Had he been too open, too vulnerable? Or is this just the chaos of grief, twisting their love into something it wasn't? Over the next few weeks, they tiptoed around each other. Ethan spent more time with friends, throwing himself into school, and David focused on work, trying to rebuild the boundaries they'd shattered. They didn't speak of that night, but it lingered in the spaces between them, an unspoken truth that shaped every glance, every word. David watched Ethan closely, noting the way he seemed lighter, as if he'd let go of some of the weight he'd carried. But there was still a question in his eyes, a search for understanding that David couldn't fully answer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David and Ethan sat on the porch, the air cool and fragrant with blooming jasmine. The silence was comfortable, a stark contrast to the tension of weeks past. Ethan turned to him, his smile small but genuine. "Thanks for being patient with me, Dad," he said, "for everything you do, for accepting me, even when I mess up." David's heart swelled, caught off guard by the sincerity in Ethan's voice. He placed a hand on Ethan's arm, the gesture steady and paternal. "That's what dads do," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll always figure it out together." Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting the fading light. For a moment, they sat in silence, the world around them quiet and still. David felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that they could move forward, but the path ahead was uncertain. The love between them was unshakable, but the lines they'd crossed had left scars, questions that lingered unanswered. As the stars began to emerge, David wondered what their future held, whether they could rebuild, or if the weight of that night would always linger. He looked at Ethan, at the young man finding his way, and knew one thing: they'd face it together, whatever came next.